The early morning sun streamed through the dusty blinds of Ibrahim Traoré's modest office in Ouagadougou. At 34 years old, the military captain turned interim leader of Burkina Faso had the weight of a nation on his shoulders. He rubbed his tired eyes and reached for the stack of papers his aide had just placed on his desk. "What's this?" he asked, noticing an envelope with official seals he didn't immediately recognize. His aide, a serious man named Kofi, who rarely smiled these days, pointed to the envelope. It came through diplomatic channels, special delivery from New York. Traoré raised an eyebrow and carefully opened the envelope. His eyes widened as he read the contents, an official invitation to the International Peace and Security Summit in New York next month. The summit would bring together leaders from around the world to discuss global security challenges. "They want me there? In New York?" he asked, genuine surprise in his voice. Since taking power, Traoré had focused almost entirely on domestic issues, fighting extremist violence in his country and trying to stabilize a nation in crisis. International diplomacy had taken a back seat. "Yes, sir," Kofi replied. "The invitation is quite clear." Traoré set the invitation down and walked to the window. Outside, he could see the morning bustle of Ouagadougou coming to life. Street, vendors setting up, motorbikes weaving through traffic, children in uniforms walking to school. These were the people he was responsible for, the people who needed security, food, education, and hope. "I can't leave now," he said firmly. "The situation in the eastern provinces is still unstable. The talks with neighboring countries need attention, and the economic reforms—" "Sir," Kofi interrupted gently, "Foreign Minister Ouedraogo thinks you should consider it. He believes it could be an opportunity to tell our story directly to those who matter on the world stage." Traoré turned from the window unconvinced. "And what story is that? That we're struggling? That we need help but don't want interference? That the old colonial patterns still shape everything we do?" Kofi stood silent for a moment before responding. "Perhaps exactly that story, sir. But told by you, not about you." Later that afternoon, Traoré sat in a meeting with his closest advisors. The invitation had sparked heated debate. "The Americans have never shown real interest in our struggles," argued Defense Minister Zungrana, a hardliner who had backed Traoré from the beginning. "This is just for show. They'll take photos with you, talk about cooperation, then continue supporting whoever serves their interests." Foreign Minister Ouedraogo shook his head. "With respect, we cannot afford to think this way anymore. Burkina Faso needs allies, trade partners, and yes, some assistance. We've been isolated too long." Traoré listened carefully to both sides. He was young for a leader and he knew it. What he lacked in years, he tried to make up for in his willingness to listen before deciding. Finance Minister Kabore, a quiet woman who spoke rarely but was always heard, cleared her throat. "There's also the practical matter. The World Bank representatives will be there. The IMF too. We're trying to renegotiate terms that were agreed to before your government. Being in the room could make a difference." Traoré nodded slowly. The country's finances were in desperate shape. The previous government had left behind crushing debt and few reserves. "And what about security while I'm gone?" he asked, looking at Zungrana. "We can manage for a week," the defense minister replied, though his face showed he wasn't happy about it. "Lieutenant Colonel Poda can coordinate operations from headquarters. Nothing major would be planned during your absence anyway." As the meeting continued, Traoré's personal assistant slipped into the room and handed him a folder. "The complete briefing on the summit, sir, including profiles of key attendees." Traoré flipped through the pages, scanning quickly. Presidents, prime ministers, diplomats. His eyes stopped at a familiar face, former President Trump, listed as part of the American delegation. "Trump will be there?" he asked, surprised. The foreign minister leaned forward. "Yes, though not in an official capacity. He's attending as part of a bipartisan delegation. It's quite common for former presidents to attend such events." Traoré studied the profile. He had watched Trump from afar during his presidency. The man was unpredictable, often said controversial things about African nations, but also wasn't afraid to break from established diplomatic patterns. Whether that was good or bad, remained to be seen. The current president will be busy with scheduled meetings, Ouedraogo continued, but these informal events, the receptions, the dinners, that's where real connections happen, and everyone will be there. That evening, Traoré sat alone in his residence, the invitation still on his mind. On his phone, he scrolled through news about the upcoming summit. The official topics seemed relevant: global security, climate change, economic cooperation. But he wondered about the unspoken agenda, the real discussions that would happen behind closed doors. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was his younger sister Ada, who had come to check on him. She was one of the few people who still treated him like a brother, rather than a leader. "You haven't eaten," she said, placing a plate of food on the table. "You need to take care of yourself." Traoré smiled tiredly. "Too much to think about." Ada sat across from him. "The New York invitation?" "News travels fast." "In this family, yes," she said with a gentle smile. "So, will you go?" Traoré shrugged. "I don't know. Part of me says it's a waste of time. Another part says we can't afford not to be there." Ada was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Do you remember when Professor Ouattara pushed you to enter that music competition? You said the same thing then." Traoré laughed softly at the memory. "That was different. I was just a boy who liked playing piano. A boy who was afraid to play in front of strangers." Ada corrected him. "But you went anyway and won second place." "Third place," he corrected with a smile. "Still," Ada said, "you were heard. That's what matters, isn't it? Being heard?" The next morning, Traoré called his team together and announced his decision. He would attend the summit, but with conditions. The trip would be short, 5 days maximum. His delegation would be small, just 3 key advisors. And they would have clear objectives for every meeting. "This isn't about photo opportunities," he told them firmly. "This is about Burkina Faso's future. We need partners, not patrons. Respect, not pity." The next 2 weeks were a flurry of preparations. Briefing papers on every major attendee, talking points on security cooperation, agricultural investment, and educational exchanges. Meetings with regional experts who knew the diplomatic landscape in New York. During one preparatory session, an intelligence officer was reviewing security protocols when he mentioned something that caught Traoré's attention. "Sir, we should note that your personal profile has been shared with the American security team." "What personal profile?" Traoré asked. The officer looked uncomfortable. "Standard procedure, sir. Basic biographical information for all attendees. Education, career highlights, languages spoken, personal interests." "What exactly did we share about my personal interests?" Traoré asked, his voice sharp. The foreign minister quickly checked his tablet. "Nothing inappropriate, sir. Just what's already public knowledge. Military training, your education background, your—" He paused, scrolling further. "Your musical background." "My musical background?" Traoré repeated. "Yes, sir. It mentions you studied piano for 7 years and performed in national competitions as a youth." "Is there a problem?" Traoré shook his head. "No. No problem." But something about this detail being included bothered him. That part of his life felt distant now. The boy who once lost himself in Chopin and Mozart was far removed from the military leader he had become. The night before their departure, Traoré found himself unable to sleep. He walked through his residence to a small room he rarely entered. There, covered in a cloth, was an upright piano, a gift from his former music teacher when he graduated. He hadn't played in years. Slowly, he pulled back the cloth and sat down. His fingers hovered over the keys, uncertain at first, then found their place. He began to play softly, a piece he had loved as a young man, a Burkinabe melody arranged for piano that told the story of the rainy season bringing life back to the land. The notes came back to him gradually, like an old friend returning after a long journey. As he played, he thought about New York, about sitting across from world leaders who knew little about his country beyond headlines about coups and terrorism. Perhaps there were some stories that couldn't be told with words alone. He closed the piano and returned to his preparations. New York awaited, and with it, a chance to be heard in more ways than one. New York City overwhelmed Ibrahim Traoré's senses from the moment Air Burkina's small delegation landed at JFK Airport. The roar of traffic, the forest of skyscrapers, the crush of people, everything stood in stark contrast to Ouagadougou's familiar rhythms. "First time in New York, sir?" asked Thomas, the UN liaison assigned to the Burkina Faso delegation. "First time in America," Traoré replied, gazing through the window of their diplomatic vehicle as it moved through Manhattan's concrete canyons. Massive digital billboards flashed advertisements overhead, while pedestrians rushed along crowded sidewalks, everyone seemingly in a hurry. Foreign Minister Ouedraogo leaned forward. "The schedule for today is light, sir. Check in at the hotel, brief meeting with our UN ambassador, then rest before tomorrow's summit opening." Traoré nodded, still taking in the city. "And the hotel, it's near the summit venue?" "Yes, the plaza. Most delegations are staying there. It's just across from Central Park and a short drive to the UN." The Plaza Hotel's gilded elegance made Traoré uncomfortable the moment he stepped into the lobby. Crystal chandeliers hung from ornate ceilings, while staff in crisp uniforms moved efficiently among guests. Their delegation was whisked to a private elevator and up to their rooms without the usual check-in procedures. In his suite, Traoré walked straight to the window. Central Park spread out before him, a surprising patch of green amid the urban landscape. For a moment it reminded him of the hunting reserves outside his hometown, though these trees were carefully arranged, nothing like the wild spaces of home. A knock at the door announced Kofi with several garment bags. "Your attire for the event, sir." The Foreign Ministry had everything prepared. Traoré examined the suits, dark blue for formal sessions, lighter gray for the reception. Both were well made but conservative, designed not to stand out. Just like the role they wanted him to play, he thought, present but not too noticeable. "The briefing papers, sir," Kofi added, setting a tablet on the desk. "Updated profiles on key attendees and talking points for tomorrow." After Kofi left, Traoré reviewed the materials, stopping again at former President Trump's profile. The Americans' unorthodox approach to diplomacy had created both opportunities and challenges in Africa. While some criticized his blunt remarks about developing nations, others appreciated how he bypassed diplomatic niceties to address issues directly. Later that evening, Traoré met with Burkina Faso's UN ambassador, a seasoned diplomat named Compaoré who had served through several governments. "The summit's real value isn't in the main sessions," Compaoré explained as they shared a simple dinner in the ambassador's modest apartment. "Those are scripted with prepared statements. The connections happen at the reception tomorrow night and the private meetings you'll have afterward." "And who exactly wants these private meetings?" Traoré asked. "So far, representatives from France, China, and Russia have requested time. The World Bank president wants 15 minutes to discuss the new infrastructure initiative." "And the Americans?" He hesitated. "Yes, they've been vague. The State Department asked about your availability, but hasn't specified who you'd meet with." Traoré set down his fork. "Not the current administration?" "Not officially, though I've heard the former president has shown interest in meeting several African leaders." The next morning brought a flurry of activity. The summit's opening ceremony featured speeches from the UN Secretary-General and the host country's representatives. Seated among rows of world leaders, Traoré observed the diplomatic dance, who spoke with whom, which delegates leaned in to whisper comments, who checked their phones during certain speeches. The American delegation sat near the front, a mix of current officials and former diplomats. Trump wasn't present for the opening session, which didn't surprise Traoré. The former president's reputation suggested he preferred direct engagement over ceremonial functions. During the lunch break, Traoré found himself surrounded by other African leaders, many curious about the young military officer who had taken control of Burkina Faso. "You've taken bold steps with your security approach," said Ghana's representative, a silver-haired man with decades of diplomatic experience. "But the French withdrawal leaves a vacuum. Who fills it?" Before Traoré could answer, Nigeria's envoy joined in. "And the Russians are already offering assistance, yes? Be careful there, young man. New friends sometimes ask higher prices than old ones." Traoré navigated these conversations carefully. He had come to listen more than speak, to understand the currents of international politics rather than immediately choose sides. The afternoon sessions dragged on with presentations about global security challenges, climate finance, and pandemic preparedness. Important topics, but the formal statements offered little beyond what could be read in press releases. Was the evening reception where everything changed. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel had been transformed for the occasion. Crystal glasses sparkled under chandeliers. Servers circulated with trays of appetizers, and a string quartet played softly in the corner. Along one wall stood a magnificent grand piano, its polished surface reflecting the room's golden lights. Traoré, dressed in his gray suit, entered with his small delegation. Immediately he felt the shift in atmosphere. Here, without microphones and cameras recording every word, diplomats spoke more freely, laughed more easily, and moved between groups with purpose. "Your Excellency," a voice called. It was the French foreign minister, a woman whose country had until recently maintained a significant military presence in Burkina Faso. "So pleased you could join us. We have much to discuss about regional security." Traoré exchanged pleasantries but kept the conversation brief. France's reduced role in the Sahel had come with both challenges and opportunities for his country. He wasn't ready to commit to new arrangements yet. As he moved through the crowd, Traoré noticed a commotion near the entrance. Former President Trump had arrived, surrounded by security and former officials. The American moved with confident ease, greeting some leaders warmly while merely nodding to others. "They say he remembers everyone he meets," Kofi murmured beside Traoré, "and never forgets if he feels slighted." "We've never met," Traoré replied. "So, at least I start with a clean slate." For the next hour, Traoré engaged in brief conversations with various officials, the type of diplomatic small talk that revealed little but established presence. He was careful not to linger too long with representatives from any particular power bloc. Burkina Faso needed flexibility, not new patrons. Across the room, Trump moved in his own orbit, occasionally laughing loudly or clapping someone on the shoulder. The former president seemed to treat the gathering more like a social club than a diplomatic function. Yet Traoré noticed how intently people listened when he spoke. "Captain Traoré," a smooth voice interrupted his observations. It was an American official he recognized from the briefing materials, a State Department veteran who specialized in African affairs. "I'm David Wilson. Pleasure to meet you." They shook hands and Wilson continued. "I understand you've had an interesting journey. From military academy to the presidential palace is quite a path." "Not one I planned," Traoré answered carefully. "But sometimes duty calls in unexpected ways." Wilson smiled. "Indeed. I've been briefing our delegation on your background. Very impressive accomplishments for someone so young." He paused, then added with seemingly casual interest, "I mentioned to a colleague that you're also an accomplished pianist. Or was that information incorrect?" The question caught Traoré off guard. "I played as a student," he replied. "But that was many years ago." "Ashamed to lose touch with music," Wilson said. "I'm told that beautiful Steinway hasn't been touched all evening." "Perhaps, I'm afraid my skills have faded," Traoré cut in. "Politics and military affairs leave little time for practice." Wilson nodded understandingly, but Traoré sensed the conversation had a purpose beyond small talk. Before he could probe further, Wilson was called away by a colleague. As the evening progressed, Traoré found himself near the refreshment table, taking a moment to observe the room. The various power dynamics were becoming clearer. Who deferred to whom? Which groups kept their distance from others? Where the real influence seemed to concentrate. He was so absorbed in his observations that he didn't immediately notice Trump approaching until the former president was standing right beside him, reaching for a glass of water. "So you're the new guy from Burkina Faso," Trump said without preamble. "They tell me you've shaken things up back home." Traoré turned, surprised by the direct approach. "Mr. President, yes, our country needed change." Trump looked him over appraisingly. "Strong military, right? That's good. Africa needs strength. Too much chaos otherwise." He took a sip of water, then added, "They say you're young, but you look like you know what you're doing." Before Traoré could respond, Wilson appeared at Trump's side and whispered something in his ear. Trump's eyebrows raised slightly, and he glanced toward the piano in the corner, then back at Traoré with newfound interest. "So you play?" Trump asked, gesturing toward the instrument with his glass. The room seemed quiet around them, nearby conversations pausing as people noticed the interaction between the young African leader and the former American president. Traoré felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere. What had been a simple diplomatic exchange was becoming something more. A test, perhaps, or an opportunity. He wasn't sure which yet. "I used to play," he answered honestly, "but it has been some time." Trump's expression brightened with unexpected enthusiasm. "You know what I've learned in business and politics? Some skills never really leave you." He raised his voice slightly, ensuring those nearby could hear. "If he plays the piano, I'll fall right here." The statement hung in the air, part challenge and part joke. Around them, diplomats and officials turned to watch, sensing a moment forming that might transcend the usual diplomatic script. And in that moment, with the room's attention suddenly fixed on him, Traoré had to decide whether to remain the cautious, strategic leader he'd planned to be at this summit, or to reveal something of the person behind the title. Time seemed to slow as Traoré felt dozens of eyes turn toward him. The challenge hung in the air, Trump's words echoing in the sudden quiet that had fallen over their corner of the reception. "If he plays the piano, I'll fall right here." Diplomatic training told Traoré to smile politely and deflect, to say something about being too rusty, about preferring to listen rather than play. That would be the safe choice, the expected response from a serious young leader who didn't want to be seen as entertainment for wealthy Western diplomats. But something else stirred inside him. A memory of his music teacher's words years ago. "Music speaks when words cannot. Sometimes the most powerful statement is one without words." Foreign Minister Ouedraogo appeared at his side, concern visible on his face. "Sir," he said quietly, "perhaps we should move on to meet the Chinese delegation as scheduled." Traoré gave his minister a reassuring nod, but didn't move. Instead, he looked directly at Trump, whose expression was a mixture of amusement and curiosity. "It has been some years since I played for an audience," Traoré said calmly. "But perhaps music is a language we can all understand, regardless of politics." Without waiting for a response, he handed his water glass to a surprised Kofi and began walking toward the grand piano. The crowd parted silently, creating a path. From the corner of his eye, he saw Trump's eyebrows rise in surprise. Clearly, the former president hadn't expected his challenge to be accepted. The magnificent Steinway stood untouched, its polished surface gleaming under the chandeliers. Traoré approached it with respect, running his fingers lightly over the fallboard before lifting it to reveal the keys. He sat down, adjusting the bench slightly. For a moment, doubt crept in. It had been years since he'd played regularly. His hands had grown more accustomed to military documents than piano keys. But as he placed his fingers on the cool ivory, a strange calm washed over him. This, at least, was something honest, something true that came from within, not filtered through diplomatic language or strategic calculation. He began simply, with a piece he had practiced countless times as a student, a traditional Burkinabe melody his teacher had arranged for piano. The notes came back to him naturally, muscle memory taking over as his fingers found their places. The tune was gentle but carried the distinct rhythmic patterns of his homeland's music, so different from Western classical traditions. The room fell completely silent. Even the servers stopped circulating with their trays. Traoré kept his eyes on the keys, focusing on letting the music speak. As the familiar melody flowed through him, he began to embellish it, adding complexity and depth that reflected the years since he'd first learned it. Without pausing, he transitioned into something unexpected, a piece by Beethoven that he'd once struggled to master. The Moonlight Sonata poured from his fingers, its melancholy notes filling the ballroom. The contrast between the traditional African melody and the European classical piece created something new, a bridge between worlds. As he played, Traoré finally looked up. The faces watching him showed surprise, appreciation, and something else, a breaking of diplomatic masks. For this moment, they weren't just seeing the young military leader of a troubled West African nation. They were seeing a person with depth, with history, with humanity. Trump stood near the front of the gathered crowd, arms crossed, expression unreadable. But he hadn't moved away. He was listening. Traoré brought the piece to a close, then paused briefly before beginning a third selection, something more contemporary, a jazz-influenced composition he'd learned during his academy days. His confidence grew as he played, fingers dancing across the keys with increasing assurance. This wasn't about showing off technical skill. It was about communication, about saying something that couldn't be expressed in prepared statements or policy documents. When he finally ended, lifting his hands from the keys, the silence held for a heartbeat before the room erupted in applause. Traoré stood, giving a small, dignified nod of acknowledgement. He hadn't played for applause, but the genuine response told him his message had been received. As he stepped away from the piano, people moved forward to congratulate him, their diplomatic reserve momentarily forgotten. The Italian ambassador clasped his hand warmly. "Magnificent. Where did you study?" "Just with a local teacher in Ouagadougou," Traoré replied. He believed music was as important as mathematics. "He was right," said another voice, a woman, Traoré, recognized as Norway's representative to the UN. "Sometimes we forget there is more to governance than policy and power." Traoré nodded in agreement, though he noticed some delegates were already drifting back to their previous conversations. The moment had made an impression, but politics would quickly reassert itself. Still, something had changed in how they saw him, and perhaps in how he saw himself in this gathering. He was looking for his delegation when he felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to find Trump standing there, a genuine smile replacing his usual guarded expression. "Well," the former president said, "I didn't actually fall, but I'm impressed. Most people in this room can talk for hours without saying anything real. You said more in 5 minutes without a single word." "Music was my first language," Traoré replied simply. "Before military strategy or politics." Trump nodded. "Smart people speak multiple languages. Tell me something, that first tune, that wasn't European, was it? Had a different feel." "It's from Burkina Faso, a folk melody about the rainy season bringing life back to the land after drought." "Interesting." Trump seemed to consider this. "You know, most Americans couldn't find your country on a map, including half the people in this room making policies that affect you." Traoré couldn't help but smile at the bluntness. "That's partly why I'm here, to be seen, to be heard." "Well, mission accomplished on that front," Trump said with a chuckle. Then lowering his voice slightly, he added, "Listen, some people on my team want to talk with you about security cooperation. Off the record. Interested?" Before Traoré could answer, they were interrupted by the current American Secretary of State, who approached with careful diplomatic poise. "Captain Traoré, that was quite unexpected and delightful," she said smoothly. "I wasn't aware we had such talent among our guests tonight." Trump didn't move away, creating an awkward triangle. The current and former administration's representatives rarely interacted cordially in public. "We were just discussing Burkina Faso's security challenges," Trump said before Traoré could respond. "Fascinating situation." "Very complex," the Secretary of State smiled tightly. "Indeed. We've been closely monitoring developments in the Sahel. Perhaps, Captain Traoré, we could arrange a brief meeting tomorrow to discuss how the current administration might be of assistance." Traoré noted the emphasis on current and the quick glance toward Trump. "Politics. Within politics, the American domestic situation, creating its own currents in international waters. I would welcome such a meeting," he replied diplomatically. "My schedule is in the hands of your protocol office." She nodded, satisfied, then turned to include Trump. "A pleasure seeing you this evening. Mr. President, I believe the Japanese delegation was hoping to speak with you about your recent comments on trade." It was a polite dismissal, and Trump recognized it as such. But instead of taking offense, he seemed amused. "I'll find them after I finish my conversation here," he said easily. "Give me 2 minutes." When she had moved away, Trump turned back to Traoré. "Politics," he said with a shake of his head. "Always politics. But what you did tonight, that cut through all the nonsense. Remember that. It's a rare skill." With that, he extended his hand. Traoré shook it firmly, aware that nearby phones were discreetly capturing the moment. "Think about that conversation," Trump said. "My people will find yours." Then he was gone, moving through the crowd with his security detail close behind. Kofi appeared at Traoré's side, visibly concerned. "Sir, are you all right?" "That was unexpected." "I'm fine," Traoré assured him. Sometimes the unexpected path is the right one. For the rest of the evening, Traoré found his reception among the diplomats subtly changed. Those who had barely acknowledged him before now made points of introducing themselves. Others asked about his country with what seemed like genuine interest rather than diplomatic obligation. The Russian representative, a stern-faced woman with calculating eyes, spoke with unusual directness. Your performance was impressive. It reminded everyone you are not just another interchangeable figure. This is good. In these rooms, being memorable is power. Later, as the reception was winding down, Traoré found himself near the refreshment table with Ghana's representative, the elder statesman who had questioned him earlier. You surprised many people tonight, young man, the Ghanaian said with a knowing smile, including our American friends. They thought they had you categorized. And now? Traoré asked. Now they must reconsider, which is always useful. He sipped his water thoughtfully. But remember, in diplomacy, visibility is a double-edged sword. You've been noticed. That brings opportunity and danger in equal measure. As Traoré and his small delegation finally returned to their hotel rooms, Foreign Minister Ouedraogo seemed troubled. Sir, while your musical talent is impressive, I'm concerned about the perception. Some might see it as undignified for a head of state. Traoré considered this as he loosened his tie. Tell me, Minister, what did we accomplish in the formal session today? Did anyone truly listen to our concerns about regional security, about economic partnerships instead of aid? Ouedraogo hesitated. Well, those discussions are ongoing. Exactly. Ongoing for years. Traoré gazed out at the New York skyline, lights glittering in the darkness. Tonight, people saw Burkina Faso differently. Not as a problem to be solved or a resource to be exploited, but as a nation with depth and culture. That's diplomacy, too. Later, alone in his room, Traoré checked the news on his tablet. Already, footage of his piano performance was circulating on social media, alongside images of his handshake with Trump. The caption on one international news site read, Unexpected cultural diplomacy. Burkina Faso's leader bridges divides through music. He set the tablet aside and walked to the window. Tomorrow would bring formal sessions, policy discussions, carefully worded joint statements. The real work of the summit. But tonight something had shifted. A door had opened that hadn't existed before. And as he looked out over the city that never sleeps, Ibrahim Traoré wondered what might walk through that door in the days to come. The morning after the piano performance, Ibrahim Traoré woke early in his hotel suite. The New York sunrise painted the skyscrapers in golden light as he stood by the window, reflecting on the previous evening. What had begun as a simple diplomatic reception had somehow transformed into something more significant. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing with notifications. Video clips of his impromptu concert were circulating on social media and news outlets. Some headlines focused on the surprise of a military leader displaying such artistic talent. Others emphasized the moment with Trump, the challenge, the performance, and most importantly, the handshake that followed. Kofi knocked and entered with a tablet in hand. Sir, your schedule for today. The Security Council meeting begins at 10, followed by bilateral talks with the French delegation at 11:30. Traoré nodded, scanning the day's agenda. And what about the American meetings? Has there been any follow-up from last night? Yes, sir. 2 requests came in this morning. Kofi scrolled through his notes. The current administration State Department has requested 30 minutes this afternoon and... He hesitated slightly. A representative from former President Trump's team has asked for a private meeting. Off the official schedule. Interesting, Traoré murmured. Accept both requests. Sir, the protocol office advises caution about unofficial meetings, especially given the complicated relationship between the former president and the current administration. Traoré understood the concern. American politics had become increasingly polarized, with foreign policy often caught in the crossfire. Meeting with Trump's people separately could be seen as playing sides. Schedule the Trump team meeting after the State Department, Traoré decided, but keep it low profile. A coffee at the hotel rather than at the summit venue. As he dressed for the day's sessions, Foreign Minister Ouedraogo arrived, looking unusually animated. Sir, have you seen the morning briefings? Your performance last night has created quite a stir. He held up his phone, showing a news alert. The piano moment is being described as cultural diplomacy at its finest by several commentators. Traoré buttoned his suit jacket. And how is it playing back home? Very positively. People are proud to see their leader showing Burkina Faso's cultural depth on the world stage. Social media is full of supportive comments. This was good news. Traoré had worried that some might view the piano playing as undignified for a head of state, especially one who had come to power through military means. Instead, it seemed to have humanized him both internationally and domestically. The morning sessions proceeded as expected: formal statements, careful diplomatic language, and few surprises. But Traoré noticed subtle differences in how other delegates approached him. Those who had barely acknowledged him before now made points of greeting him. Several mentioned his musical talent as an icebreaker before discussing more serious matters. During a coffee break, the German chancellor approached him directly, something that hadn't happened the previous day. "Captain Traoré," she said warmly, "I must compliment you on your performance last evening. Beethoven is close to my heart, and you played the Moonlight Sonata beautifully." "Thank you, Madam Chancellor. Music has always been important in my country, though we're rarely recognized for it internationally." She nodded thoughtfully. "Perhaps that's the broader point, isn't it? There's so much we don't see about each other's nations beyond the headlines." She lowered her voice slightly. "I understand you'll be meeting with the Americans today about security cooperation?" Traoré maintained a neutral expression. News traveled fast in diplomatic circles. "We have several meetings scheduled, yes. I hope they're productive. Europe remains committed to stability in the Sahel region, though our approaches have sometimes differed. Perhaps we could schedule a more detailed discussion before you leave New York." This was exactly the kind of opening Traoré had hoped the summit might provide. "I would welcome that, Madam Chancellor." By lunchtime, Traoré had received meeting requests from 3 additional countries that had previously shown little interest in direct talks with Burkina Faso. The piano moment had somehow created diplomatic opportunities that weeks of formal negotiations might not have achieved. The afternoon meeting with the State Department officials was cordial but predictable. They expressed concern about terrorist activity in the Sahel, offered modest security assistance with significant political strings attached, and gently questioned Burkina Faso's growing relationships with Russia and China. Traoré listened politely, knowing this was a dance both sides understood. America wanted influence without deep commitment. Burkina Faso needed security support without surrendering sovereignty. Little of substance was agreed upon, but doors remained open. More interesting was the meeting that followed at a quiet corner table in the hotel's mezzanine lounge. The man who joined Traoré introduced himself simply as Robert, a security advisor with close ties to Trump. "The former president was impressed by you," Robert said, skipping the usual diplomatic pleasantries, "both by your playing and by how you've handled the security situation in your country." "Please convey my thanks," Traoré replied. "Though I must say our security challenges remain significant." Robert nodded. "That's actually what I wanted to discuss. Not the official line you heard from the State Department earlier." He lowered his voice. "The former president maintains significant influence with private security contractors, defense manufacturers, and intelligence networks. If you're interested, there may be ways to arrange more direct assistance than what's currently on the table." Traoré kept his expression neutral, though this was an intriguing development. "What kind of assistance?" "Training for your special forces. Equipment without the usual congressional oversight delays. Real-time intelligence on terrorist movements across your borders, all through private channels. And what would be expected in return?" Robert smiled slightly. "Less than you might think. Future commercial access for American companies when security improves. A counterbalance to growing Russian and Chinese influence. No need to cut ties with them. Just ensure America has a seat at the table too." The proposition was both promising and dangerous. Working through unofficial channels could provide needed resources faster than traditional diplomatic routes. But it risked angering the current administration and potentially being caught in American political crossfire. "I'll need to consider this carefully," Traoré said. "Of course. We're having dinner tomorrow night at Trump's hotel downtown. The former president asked me to extend an invitation. Small gathering, private dining room, no press. Now that was unexpected. Please thank him for the invitation. I'll check my schedule." As Robert left, Traoré remained at the table thinking. In less than 24 hours, his diplomatic position had shifted dramatically. The piano, something from his past, something personal, had somehow opened doors that formal credentials and military rank had not. That evening, Traoré had dinner with his delegation in their hotel. The conversation inevitably turned to the unusual developments of the day. The Trump invitation is problematic, Foreign Minister Ouedraogo warned. The current administration would see it as a slight, but potentially valuable, countered Defense Minister Zungrana. We need security assistance that actually addresses our needs, not what Western bureaucrats think we need. Traoré listened to the debate, weighing options. What if we accept both paths? He finally said. We continue formal talks with the current administration while exploring what Trump's network can offer. Neither side can provide everything we need. Playing both sides is risky, Ouedraogo cautioned. Not both sides, Traoré corrected. All sides, including the Europeans who suddenly want to talk. The Russians and Chinese, too. For the first time, we have multiple powers interested in what we have to say. The next day brought a series of bilateral meetings, each more productive than Traoré had anticipated. The French, who had been reducing their military presence in the Sahel, suddenly proposed new security arrangements. The Chinese ambassador hinted at infrastructure investments. A Russian envoy suggested favorable terms for military equipment. During a brief break, Traoré stepped outside for some fresh air. New York's energy and pace were exhausting after days of non-stop diplomacy. As he stood on a terrace overlooking the city, he was surprised to find Trump himself walking over, having just exited another meeting. There he is, the piano man, Trump said with a smile, extending his hand. How's the summit treating you today? Much differently than yesterday, Traoré admitted, shaking hands. Trump laughed. Isn't that something? One moment of being real in a room full of phonies and suddenly everyone wants to know you. He glanced around to ensure they weren't being overheard. Did Robert find you? Yes, we had a productive conversation. Good, he's a smart guy, knows his stuff about your region. Better than half the so-called experts at state. Trump looked directly at Traoré. You coming to dinner tonight? Small group, good people. We can talk more about how to deal with those terrorists making trouble on your borders. I'm considering the invitation. You should come. No official business, just good food and straight talk. Something told me when I heard you play that you're a straight talk kind of leader. Those are rare these days. After Trump moved on, Traoré received a message that the Secretary General of the United Nations requested a brief meeting. This was unprecedented. The head of the UN rarely made time for leaders of smaller nations, especially those who had come to power through non-democratic means. The meeting was brief but substantive. The Secretary General expressed interest in Burkina Faso's security situation and offered to personally support expanded UN peacekeeping operations along its troubled borders. Your presence here has been quite impactful, the Secretary General noted. Sometimes we need to be reminded that behind every security crisis are real people with rich cultures and deep humanity. That evening, Traoré made his decision. He would attend the dinner at Trump's hotel, but also accept a breakfast meeting with the current administration's national security advisor the following morning. He would meet with the European delegation in the afternoon and the Chinese representatives in the evening. He would navigate between all these powers, maintaining independence while leveraging their competing interests to Burkina Faso's advantage. As his car drove through the glittering New York streets toward Trump's hotel, Traoré reflected on how a simple piano performance had changed everything. He had come to New York as a peripheral figure, the young military leader of a troubled African nation that most delegates could barely locate on a map. Now, suddenly, he was at the center of a diplomatic dance involving the world's major powers, all because he had chosen authenticity over caution in a key moment. His phone buzzed with a message from home, from his sister Aida. She had sent a photo of their old family home, with the upright piano visible in the corner. Her message read simply, "Mother always said your music would open doors. She would be proud today." Traoré smiled as the car pulled up to the hotel. Whatever came from this dinner, whatever alliances formed or opportunities emerged in the days ahead, he had already accomplished something important. He had shown the world that Burkina Faso was more than its challenges. It had culture, talent, and a voice worth hearing. And in the complex symphony of international relations, finding your true voice was perhaps the most powerful diplomatic tool of all. 6 months had passed since the New York summit, and Ibrahim Traoré stood at the window of his office in Ouagadougou, watching the afternoon rain wash the dusty streets clean. The rainy season had come early this year, a blessing for farmers across Burkina Faso. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Kofi entered carrying a leather portfolio. "The final report on the Northern Province Security Initiative, sir," he said, placing it on the desk. "And a reminder that the Chinese ambassador is scheduled to visit at 4. Traoré nodded. "Thank you. And the call with Washington?" "Confirmed for tomorrow morning, 7 a.m. our time." After Kofi left, Traoré sat at his desk reflecting on how much had changed since that evening at the plaza. Hotel, the moment at the piano, what he'd thought might be dismissed as merely an entertaining diversion, had somehow become a turning point in his country's diplomatic relations. The images had circulated widely. The young African leader, playing traditional melodies and classical pieces with equal skill, and later shaking hands with the former American president. What might have seemed like simple social media fodder had transformed into something unexpected, a Dabi symbol of cultural bridge building that resonated far beyond the summit's formal declarations. His phone chimed with a message. It was from Ada, his sister. "Turn on international news. Channel 4. Curious, Traoré picked up the remote and switched on the television mounted on his office wall. A familiar face filled the screen. Trump at a business forum in Dubai, responding to questions. "And when you talk about unexpected partnerships," Trump was saying, "I think about countries like Burkina Faso. Most people don't know much about it, but they're doing interesting things there. I met their leader, young guy, military background but sharp as a tack, plays the piano like nobody's business." The interviewer looked surprised. "That seems an unusual detail to note about a head of state," Trump shrugged. "Maybe, but it tells you something important. Here's a guy who can be tough when needed. He's fighting terrorists, making hard decisions. But he's also got depth culture. That combination matters. We've been having some very productive conversations about regional security." Traoré switched off the television, a slight smile crossing his face. The unlikely connection that had formed that night had indeed led to productive conversations. 3 weeks after returning from New York, he'd received a call from a former security advisor in Trump's administration, now running a private consulting firm. The resulting dialogue had opened doors to security cooperation that bypassed the usual diplomatic red tape. Training for special forces, intelligence sharing on terrorist movements across the Sahel, and direct equipment sales without the usual political conditions attached. Not everyone had been pleased. The French government had expressed concerns about the shifting alliance. The current U.S. administration had scrambled to offer its own package of assistance. Russia and China had both increased their overtures. Suddenly, Burkina Faso found itself with options rather than obligations. A text message interrupted his thoughts. It was from Foreign Minister Ouedraogo, who was in Paris for talks. French offering increased development aid for northern provinces. Clear response to American security deals. Exactly as you predicted. The strategy was working. By creating competition among foreign powers, Burkina Faso could negotiate better terms. Aid without political interference. Security cooperation without surrendering sovereignty. Later that afternoon, as Traoré prepared for his meeting with the Chinese ambassador, he received another visitor, Professor Ouattara, his old piano teacher. Now in his 70s, the professor still taught music at the university and had recently been appointed cultural minister in Traoré's government. "The new music academy plans," the old man said, spreading architectural drawings across the desk. "Construction begins next month." Traoré examined the plans with approval. The National Music Academy had been a dream for decades, but funding had always been diverted to more practical concerns. Now, with new international partnerships and improved security bringing economic growth, cultural projects were finally moving forward. 20 scholarships for talented students from rural areas, Professor Ouattara continued proudly. And the international exchange program with conservatories in America, France, and China. And the community program, Traoré asked, expanding to 15 villages next year. Basic instruments and visiting teachers twice monthly. This particular initiative was close to Traoré's heart, bringing music education to children in remote villages, just as a traveling teacher had once recognized his own talent in a small classroom far from the capital. "Excellent," Traoré said. "The security situation in the eastern provinces?" Much improved. The teaching teams feel safe traveling there now. After Professor Ouattara left, Traoré prepared for his meeting with the Chinese ambassador. But his mind kept returning to a conversation he'd had with Trump during a phone call 3 months after the summit. "You know what impressed me?" Trump had said. "Not just that you could play. Lots of people can play piano. It's that you were willing to take a risk. Most politicians, they're scared to death of doing anything unscripted, but you saw an opportunity and took it." The observation had been surprisingly insightful. The piano moment had been a calculated risk, but one that showed authenticity in a room full of diplomatic pretense. At precisely 4 o'clock, the Chinese ambassador was shown into the office. They exchanged pleasantries before turning to the main topic: China's proposed infrastructure investments in Burkina Faso's transportation network. "We've reviewed your proposal," Traoré said, "and have some adjustments to suggest." The ambassador nodded politely, but Traoré could see the surprise in his eyes when shown the counter-proposal. 6 months ago, Burkina Faso would have gratefully accepted whatever terms were offered. Now they were negotiating as equals. "These terms are ambitious," the ambassador said carefully. "They're fair," Traoré replied, "and similar to what we've established in recent agreements with American and European partners." The mention of American partnerships wasn't accidental. China's competition with the U.S. for influence in Africa was no secret. "I'll convey these requests to Beijing," the ambassador said. "I believe we can find common ground." After the meeting, Traoré had a final appointment for the day, a video call with a group of students from the National University. This monthly tradition had begun shortly after his return from New York, part of his effort to connect directly with the country's youth. The students' faces appeared on screen, eager and curious. Their questions ranged from security policy to educational reform, but eventually, one young woman asked the question he'd been expecting. "Sir, many of us were inspired by the video of you playing piano at the International Summit. Has music influenced your approach to leadership?" Traoré considered the question thoughtfully. "Music taught me that technical skill matters, but so does heart. The different notes can create harmony or discord, that listening is as important as performing." He smiled. "And that sometimes an unexpected performance can change the entire conversation." After the call ended, Traoré found himself alone in his office as evening fell. On impulse, he walked down the hallway to a small room that had once been a storage closet. Inside was the upright piano from his home, moved to the presidential palace at Professor Ouattara's suggestion. "Leaders need moments of reflection," the old teacher had said. "Music provides that space." Traoré sat at the piano, letting his fingers find the keys without thought. The melody that emerged was the same Burkinabe folk song he'd played in New York, but he played it differently now, with new variations, new depth. Just as his country's story was evolving, finding new expressions while honoring its roots. A knock at the door announced Kofi. "Sir, the Security Council is assembled for the evening briefing." Traoré nodded, closing the piano. "I'll be right there." As he walked to the meeting, his phone buzzed with an incoming message. It was from an American number, Trump's special advisor confirming their call for the following day with a personal note added, "The boss still talks about your piano playing. Says it was the highlight of a boring summit. Some diplomats just talk, but you actually said something." Traoré smiled to himself. In the complex world of international politics, genuine moments were rare. That unexpected piano performance had cut through layers of diplomatic protocol, creating an opening where real communication could happen. The next morning, Traoré rose early and walked onto the balcony of the presidential residence. The sun was just breaking over Ouagadougou, painting the city in gold. In the distance, he could see farmers heading to their fields, merchants setting up market stalls, children walking to school. The daily rhythm of a nation continuing despite challenges. When his phone rang precisely at 7, he answered with confidence. "Good evening, Mr. President." He smiled at the 11-hour time difference. "Yes, I've reviewed the security proposal. I have some thoughts to share." As they spoke, Traoré looked out over his capital city, feeling the weight and privilege of leadership. The path ahead remained challenging: terrorist threats, economic hardships, political pressures from all sides. But for the first time in years, Burkina Faso was being heard on its own terms in the global conversation, all because of an unexpected moment of music in a crowded room of diplomats. All because he had chosen authenticity over protocol when a former president had issued a joking challenge. "If he plays the piano, I'll fall right here." Trump hadn't literally fallen that night, but something had shifted. Bridges had formed where walls had stood before. And in the delicate dance of international relations, such moments of genuine human connection were as rare and valuable as gold in the desert. As he concluded the call, Traoré made a mental note to thank his old piano teacher once again, for teaching him that sometimes the most powerful diplomatic statement is one without words at all.